At 7:34 a.m. on May 9, 1980, 1,297 feet of the Sunshine Skyway Bridge disappeared into Tampa Bay. The southbound span that collapsed, the newer of the two parallel bridges, had been built in 1971 to handle increasing traffic. It had stood for less than a decade. The numbers matter because they tell you what kind of failure this was. Not a crack, not a sag, not a piece of railing. Nearly a quarter-mile of roadway, the entire southbound span between two massive support piers, dropped 150 feet into the water below. A Greyhound bus went with it. So did a pickup truck and 6 cars. 35 people died, most of them before they understood what was happening. The Sunshine Skyway was a major bay crossing, a 4-lane bridge carrying Interstate 275 across the mouth of Tampa Bay. It existed because Southwest Florida needed a reliable corridor between St. Petersburg and Bradenton, and because the Port of Tampa needed vessels to reach open water. Every day, thousands of cars crossed above while cargo ships passed underneath. It was exactly the kind of infrastructure you don't think about until the morning it isn't there anymore. What made the collapse catastrophic wasn't the storm or the ship or even the impact itself. It was that one destroyed pier could take an entire span with it. The bridge wasn't designed to survive that kind of hit because the system assumed it would never be hit at all. The promise. The original Sunshine Skyway opened in 2 phases, a northbound span in 1954, then a newer southbound span in 1971. By 1980, the 2 parallel bridges formed a continuous crossing, modern infrastructure built to handle Florida's explosive growth and the increasing scale of maritime commerce. The original bridge had been built by the Virginia Bridge Company and opened in 1954, with engineering work by Parsons, Brinkerhoff, Hall, and McDonald. It was dedicated to William Ennis Dean, a Florida state engineer who pioneered the use of pre-stressed concrete beams in bridge construction. The bridge existed because geography demanded it. Tampa Bay is a massive estuary, roughly 400 square miles of water, forming one of the largest natural harbors on the Gulf of Mexico. At its narrowest point, where the bay meets the Gulf, the crossing is still several miles wide. Before the Skyway, the only way to travel between St. Petersburg and Bradenton was to drive around the entire bay, a journey that added hours to what should have been a simple trip. The bridge collapsed distance, turned a geographic barrier into a 5-minute crossing. But Tampa Bay wasn't just a barrier to cars. It was, and is, an essential shipping corridor. The Port of Tampa handles millions of tons of cargo annually: petroleum, phosphate, steel, containers, bulk goods. Ships entering and leaving the port must pass through the mouth of the bay, right where the bridge crosses. The Skyway couldn't just connect communities. It had to coexist with maritime traffic. The engineering challenge was straightforward: connect 2 communities across a major shipping channel while allowing vessels to pass underneath. The solution was a high-level bridge with a central navigation span. Tall enough for most ships, marked clearly on every nautical chart. The implied promise was simple. When you drove onto the Skyway, the road would be there. When you piloted a ship through the channel, you'd have clear passage and reliable navigation. The system worked because both modes of traffic followed their designated paths. Cars stayed on the bridge. Ships stayed in the channel. Procedures and visibility kept them apart. This wasn't ancient infrastructure. The southbound span that collapsed had been open less than a decade. It was designed to modern standards, built with post-tensioned concrete, engineered for hurricane-force winds. Modern for 1971 meant robust structural design, attention to wind loads and wave action, careful analysis of traffic projections and material performance. It carried tens of thousands of vehicles every day without incident. The bridge worked because the system around it worked. Weather forecasts, marine pilots, navigation aids, traffic patterns refined over decades. The baseline was reliability. You could plan your route across Tampa Bay knowing the bridge would be there. Commuters built their lives around it, where they lived, where they worked, how they moved through their days. Ports could schedule vessel movements knowing the channel was open and the clearances were consistent. Trucking companies routed freight through Southwest Florida, confident the crossing would be available. The whole arrangement depended on predictability, until the morning conditions made prediction impossible. What made the Skyway viable was concentration. The bridge funneled all north-south highway traffic through a single elevated corridor, eliminating the need for ferries or lengthy detours around the bay. It was efficient, fast, and unambiguous. If you needed to cross Tampa Bay by car, you took the Skyway. There was no meaningful alternative for the corridor it served. This wasn't a problem. It was the point. Concentration creates efficiency. A single bridge is easier to maintain than multiple crossings. A defined route is easier to manage than dispersed traffic. The system works better when everyone uses the same path. The shipping channel worked the same way. Vessels entering or leaving the port of Tampa followed a defined route under the bridge's main span, guided by buoys, charts, and marine pilots who knew every current and landmark. The port of Tampa isn't a small operation. It's one of the largest ports in the southeastern United States. Ships carrying petroleum from refineries, bulk carriers loaded with phosphate from Central Florida's mines, container ships connecting Tampa to Caribbean and Latin American markets, all of them used the same channel. The alternative would have been chaos. Vessels navigating unpredictably, crossing paths, creating hazards for each other and for the bridge. The channel concentrated maritime traffic into a predictable path, just as the bridge concentrated automotive traffic overhead. Concentration creates throughput. When ships know exactly where to go and cars have a clear route, the whole system moves faster. Port operators can schedule arrivals and departures with precision. Drivers can time their commutes. Freight logistics become reliable. The predictability enables planning, and planning enables economic activity that depends on reliable movement of goods and people. But concentration also creates dependency. When every ship uses the same channel and every car uses the same bridge, you've built a system where nothing can go wrong. The entire arrangement assumes perfect conditions: clear visibility, working navigation equipment, functioning weather warnings, accurate pilotage. As long as those conditions hold, the system hums along invisibly. Ships pass under the bridge, cars pass over it, and nobody gives it a second thought. The bridge becomes infrastructure in the truest sense, something so reliable it disappears from conscious thought. The hidden cost was single-point failure. Concentrate all your traffic through one corridor, and that corridor becomes irreplaceable. Design your bridge around the assumption that ships will navigate precisely, and you don't need massive protection around your support piers. The Skyway's main piers weren't surrounded by dolphins or impact barriers. They stood in the channel, marked on charts, relying on procedures to keep vessels clear. The piers were painted for visibility, lit at night, charted on every navigation map used in Tampa Bay. Marine pilots knew their exact locations. Under normal conditions, that was enough. This wasn't negligence. It was how most bridges operated at the time. The system assumed operational control was sufficient. Pilots knew where the piers were. Ships had radar. Weather services issued warnings. Collisions happened, but catastrophic impacts on critical supports were considered low-probability events. Statistical outliers, not design cases. Building massive protective structures around every pier would have been expensive, would have narrowed the channel, might have created new navigation hazards. The cost-benefit analysis suggested that investing in operational control, better pilotage, better weather information, better traffic management, was more efficient than building physical protection against rare events. The weapon was efficiency through concentration. The cost was fragility through single-point dependency. The bridge kept the channel moving by relying on navigation and procedures instead of physical protection. That reliance worked right up until it didn't. Here's the assumption that made the collapse possible. Operational control is enough. Physical impact redundancy is optional. The logic was defensible. Bridges can't be built to survive every possible impact. A bridge pier hit by a fully loaded supertanker traveling at speed would fail, regardless of protective structures. There's no economically feasible way to build protection against every worst-case scenario. Making every pier collision-proof would require massive protective structures, dolphins, artificial islands, sacrificial barriers that would cost enormous sums, narrow navigable channels, and potentially interfere with the navigation they're meant to protect. The question becomes, where do you draw the line? How much protection is enough? How do you balance maritime access against structural invulnerability? The answer, for most of the 20th century, was to invest in the systems that prevent collisions rather than the structures that survive them. Pilotage, radar, weather forecasts, traffic management. This approach treats bridge piers like aircraft engines. You don't design an engine expecting it to fail. You design the whole system to prevent failure. Maintenance schedules, monitoring systems, procedural safeguards, redundancy in other areas. Everything focuses on ensuring the critical component never faces the scenario it can't survive. For the Skyway, this meant the bridge was designed around the assumption that marine traffic would be controlled. Ships would know where they were. Pilots would have visibility. Weather services would warn of dangerous conditions. Navigation aids, buoys, lights, radar markers would provide constant reference points. If all those layers worked, the piers didn't need to withstand a direct hit from a 35,000-ton freighter. The collision simply wouldn't happen. It's worth understanding why this philosophy felt reasonable. Bridge ship collisions, while not unheard of, were relatively rare events. Most collisions resulted in minor damage: scraped fenders, cracked concrete, dented steel. Major structural failures were exceptional. The vast majority of ships transited the channel without incident. Marine pilots were professionals with years of experience. The system worked thousands of times for every time it failed. The National Weather Service was part of this layered system. When severe weather moved through Tampa Bay, they were supposed to issue warnings for mariners, radio broadcasts alerting vessels to reduced visibility, high winds, hazardous conditions. Those warnings weren't suggestions. They were the foundation of safe navigation. A pilot operating in a squall could rely on updated weather information to make informed decisions about whether to proceed, to wait for conditions to improve, or to seek alternative anchorage. Weather warnings were a critical layer in the operational control model. If you know a storm is coming, You don't navigate blind into a confined channel with bridge piers on both sides. The Tampa Bay Vessel Traffic System existed to manage the flow of ships through the channel. By 1980, it provided basic coordination, tracking vessel movements, maintaining communication with pilots, managing the sequence of arrivals and departures. It worked, but it wasn't state-of-the-art. Overseas, ports in more challenging conditions, Rotterdam, Singapore, Hong Kong, had implemented sophisticated vessel traffic systems with comprehensive radar surveillance, active traffic management, and mandatory reporting procedures. These systems didn't just track ships, they managed them actively, intervening when situations became risky, directing vessels to safe positions, enforcing separation distances. Studies had already identified that Tampa Bay's system could be improved. The recommendations weren't radical: upgrade radar coverage, enhance communication protocols, provide better real-time monitoring of vessel movements. But recommendations don't change systems overnight. Upgrades cost money, require personnel, demand coordination across multiple agencies and stakeholders. And as long as nothing went wrong, the existing approach felt adequate. The pilots knew what they were doing. The channel was well marked. Serious incidents were rare. This is the pattern. Professionals identify a limitation, recommend improvements, and then wait while the system continues operating the way it always has. It's not malice or stupidity, it's inertia. The normal case keeps happening, and the abnormal case remains theoretical until it stops being theoretical. Every day the bridge stands, every ship that passes safely under the span reinforces the sense that the system works. The accumulation of successful operations creates confidence. Why spend millions upgrading a traffic system when the current one handles daily operations without problems? The fatal philosophy wasn't that people ignored risks. It was that they optimized for the base case and treated deviations as acts of God. If visibility failed, if warnings weren't issued, if a pilot lost his references in a squall, that combination of failures felt like catastrophic bad luck, not a foreseeable outcome of system design. Individual failures could be dismissed as anomalies. The compounding of multiple failures, no weather warning, zero visibility, degraded radar, navigational uncertainty, felt like the kind of perfect storm that no reasonable system could anticipate or prevent. But that's what makes it a tragedy. It wasn't unforeseeable. It was just unlikely enough that the system never hardened against it. The philosophy of operational control worked brilliantly under normal conditions and failed catastrophically when conditions stopped being normal. And Tampa Bay, with its position at the interface of bay and gulf, with its afternoon thunderstorms and morning squalls, was never guaranteed normal conditions. The warning existed. It just wasn't loud enough. Before May 9, 1980, professionals had already identified that the Tampa Bay vessel traffic system needed upgrades. The level of traffic management in place was lower than what more challenging overseas ports used as standard practice. The recommendations weren't vague. Improve radar coverage, enhance communication protocols, provide better real-time monitoring of vessel movements. These weren't experimental ideas. They were proven approaches used successfully elsewhere. The system didn't upgrade, not because anyone dismissed safety, but because the existing approach worked well enough most of the time. Marine pilots navigated the channel daily without incident. Collisions were rare. Fatal bridge strikes were even rarer. When you're managing a busy port and a critical bridge crossing, you allocate resources based on observed problems, not theoretical ones. This is how warning flares fail. They don't get ignored. They get acknowledged and then deprioritized. Someone writes a report. The report makes sensible recommendations. Those recommendations enter a queue behind more urgent needs, more visible problems, more politically tractable projects. Years pass. The system continues operating. The warning fades into background noise. The cost-benefit analysis made sense on paper. Upgrading a vessel traffic system requires money, personnel, equipment, coordination across agencies. The payoff is diffuse. Slightly better information, marginally improved decision-making, incrementally reduced risk. You can't point to the collisions that didn't happen because of an upgrade. You can only spend the money and hope it was worth it. So the system continued operating on procedures and pilotage, on weather forecasts and navigation aids, on the accumulated experience of hundreds of successful transits through the channel. It worked because it had always worked. The bridge stood because ships stayed clear. Ships stayed clear because pilots knew what they were doing. Until the morning when the weather made it impossible to know anything at all. On the morning of May 9th, 1980, the freighter Summit Venture was inbound to Tampa Bay in the middle of a severe squall. Visibility was near zero. Rain fell so hard that radar became unreliable. The pilot, John Lero, 37 years old, experienced, with one of the cleanest safety records among Tampa Bay pilots, lost his visual references. He couldn't see the Skyway Bridge less than a mile away. He couldn't even see the freighter's bow. He was navigating by instruments and memory, in conditions that should have triggered a severe weather warning, but no warning was issued. The National Weather Service had failed to broadcast a marine warning for the squall moving through Tampa Bay that morning. It came up too fast, materialized from the Gulf without the advance notice that pilots depended on. It was a systems failure, not a person failure. The warning protocols didn't catch the developing conditions in time. Pilots operating in the area didn't have the information they needed to make informed decisions about whether to proceed or hold position. Bruce Atkins, a trainee pilot on his final day of training aboard the Summit Venture, was manning the ship's radar when it failed, at the exact moment Lero needed to execute an 18-degree turn to safely clear the bridge. "We hit it softly," Atkins would recall decades later. "It felt like we hit a sock. I didn't feel the vessel move. I didn't feel it shudder." Lero tried to save it. He ordered the anchors dropped and the engines full astern. But the Summit Venture was 609 feet long and weighed 35,000 tons, riding high in the water without cargo. In the storm's grip, with wind pushing from an unexpected direction, the ship was slow to respond. "We're not gonna do this. We're not gonna do this," Atkins thought as the bow closed on the pier. At 7:34 a.m., the Summit Venture struck the Skyway's southbound bridge at Pier 2S, a secondary support. The pier, designed for vertical loads and wind resistance, was not designed to survive a direct impact from a vessel of that size. The pier was destroyed. Not damaged, destroyed. Within seconds, Lero understood what had happened. His voice came over the radio. "Mayday! Coast Guard, Mayday! Bridge crossing is down." Then, moments later, with awful clarity, "The bridge is down. Call all emergency equipment onto the Skyway Bridge. The Skyway Bridge is down. This is a major emergency situation. Stop the traffic on that Skyway Bridge." When the pier failed, the entire southbound span between supports collapsed. 1,297 feet of roadway, the full section the destroyed pier had been holding up, dropped 150 feet into Tampa Bay. 6 vehicles were crossing the bridge in the rain when the span vanished. A Greyhound bus carrying 26 passengers, many of them college students heading home for Mother's Day weekend. 6 were from Tuskegee University, traveling together to Florida, ready to see their mothers after a long semester. A pickup truck driven by Wesley McIntyre, who would be the only survivor. His truck bounced off the Summit Venture's bow before plunging into the water, where the ship's crew pulled him out. 6 cars. Most of the drivers didn't see the missing section in time. One car, a yellow Buick, stopped at the edge, its tires just 14 inches from empty air. The photograph of that car stopped at the jagged end of broken pavement, the ship visible in the water below, twisted steel and concrete where the road should have been, became the image no one could unsee. 35 people died. Robert Raiola, the Florida Department of Transportation diver who recovered the bodies, carried the weight of what he saw for the rest of his life. I was the one who saw the last expression on their face, he said decades later. I said a soft prayer and apologized to each one of those victims that I picked up and removed from that bus, every single one of them. Most drowned in their vehicles after the fall. The bus went down with nearly everyone inside. The youngest victim was an infant. The oldest was 92 years old. The poison wasn't the storm. It wasn't Lero's judgment. It wasn't even the impact. The poison was that a single destroyed pier could take down an entire span of bridge. The system had assumed the pier would never be hit. When that assumption failed, there was no redundancy, no backup, no way for the structure to survive. This is what kills trust. Not the accident itself. Accidents happen. But the revelation that the system wasn't designed to survive its own failure modes. A bridge is supposed to be the stable part of your day. You drive onto it assuming the road exists on the other side. The Skyway violated that assumption in the most visceral way possible. The bridge vanished while people were crossing it. After May 9th, every bridge became suspect. If the Skyway could disappear, what about the other bay crossings, the river bridges, the elevated interchanges? The physical infrastructure didn't change, but the public assumption did. The social contract, when you build a bridge, it stays there, had been broken. The collapse happened in seconds. The aftermath unfolded over years. The immediate response was catastrophic loss. 35 confirmed deaths. A major interstate highway severed. The port of Tampa's main shipping channel blocked by wreckage. The southbound Skyway was gone, and the northbound span, older, structurally similar, was immediately closed for inspection. Southwest Florida's primary north-south corridor had disappeared. Emergency crews worked through the wreckage while engineers assessed the surviving structure. The northbound bridge was eventually reopened to two-way traffic, but it was a temporary solution. The bridge's vulnerability was now undeniable. Another collision, another storm, another failure of visibility or procedure, it could happen again. For John Lero, the disaster became a life sentence. He was cleared of wrongdoing by both a state grand jury and a Coast Guard investigation, ruled 3-2 that Lero was partly responsible, but that other factors, including the storm and the lack of weather warnings, had contributed. A judge would later declare that Lero did not act negligently and did act reasonably under the circumstances. But exoneration didn't bring peace. Steve Yared, the attorney who defended Lero, became his friend through the trial. He always wished he could have done more to change the outcome, Yared said. He became the scapegoat. Lero returned to piloting ships in Tampa Bay, but 8 months later he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. The disease forced him to retire. He died in 2002 at age 59, haunted to the end by the 35 people who died that morning. His attorney called him the 36th victim of the disaster. For Atkins, the trainee pilot who was there on the bridge that morning, it was a life-defining day that he would replay in his mind for decades, wondering if different decisions would have yielded different results. Within months, the decision was made. The Skyway would be replaced entirely. Not repaired, not reinforced, replaced with a new bridge designed around a different philosophy. Bob Graham, who had been Florida's governor for less than a year and a half when the bridge fell, made the critical choice. Some legislators and transportation officials wanted to repair the bridge or rebuild it as it was, prioritizing cost efficiency. Graham wanted something else, a landmark in the nation, spanning the entrance to Tampa Bay. He pushed for a striking cable-stayed design modeled after a bridge he'd seen in France, the Breton Bridge over the Seine, surrounded with security measures that would prevent such an incident from happening again. The old assumption that operational control would prevent collisions was dead. The new bridge would assume collisions were inevitable and design accordingly. While the replacement was being planned, the broader transportation and maritime industries were already responding. The Skyway collapse became a catalyst. It wasn't the first bridge ship collision, but it was the most catastrophic in modern U.S. history. And it happened in an era when engineering standards were becoming more sophisticated and formalized. Professional organizations, federal agencies, and state departments of transportation began standardizing approaches to vessel collision protection. The American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, AASHTO, would eventually publish formal guidance on bridge protection in 1991, more than a decade after the Skyway collapse. That guidance reflected a fundamental shift. Bridges in navigable waters were now designed with the expectation that they might be struck. Protective structures, dolphins, artificial islands, sacrificial barriers became standard considerations, not optional add-ons. The philosophy changed from prevent the collision to survive the collision. The replacement Sunshine Skyway Bridge opened in 1987. It was designed by Eugene C. Figg, Jr., and Gene Mueller of the Figg and Mueller Engineering Group, and built by the American Bridge Company. Figg had designed the bridge to be a work of art that would evoke comparisons to a sailboat or a giant harp. The cables, painted bright yellow as a tribute to Florida, as the Sunshine State. It became immediately recognizable. A cable-stayed bridge with soaring towers and a distinctive yellow main span, elegant in a way the old concrete spans had never been. When it opened, it was the longest cable-stayed concrete bridge in the world. But the real change wasn't aesthetic. The new bridge's piers were surrounded by massive concrete dolphins, protective barriers designed to absorb and deflect vessel impacts. A ship striking a dolphin would be damaged, possibly sink, but it wouldn't reach the bridge's critical supports. The shipping channel was widened by 50% compared to the old bridge, and the vertical clearance was increased to 190 feet, giving ships more room to maneuver and more margin for error. The new main span was positioned to the east of where the old spans had stood, giving incoming vessels more time to make the required turn, more time than the Summit Venture had been given that morning in the storm. The system had learned. The hard way, but it learned. Physical protection replaced procedural assumption. The new bridge was designed for the world as it actually was, not the world as engineers hoped it would be. The old bridge approaches, the sections of elevated roadway leading up to where the main spans had stood, remained intact. Rather than demolish them, Florida repurposed the structures. They became the Skyway Fishing Pier State Park, the longest fishing pier in the world, a strange memorial where people could stand on the remnants of the old bridge and look out at where the spans used to be. Before the old bridge was demolished in 1993, Wesley McIntyre, the only survivor of the collapse, was given the chance to drive over it one last time. Accompanied by his wife, he stopped at the apex of the bridge. There, he dropped 35 white carnations into the water below, one for each person who died in the disaster. It's a peculiar kind of remembrance. The old Skyway still exists, but it doesn't go anywhere. You can drive onto the approach, park, walk out to the end and fish in the waters where the bridge once crossed. It's functional and utilitarian, and haunted all at once. The new Skyway is one of the most recognizable bridges in Florida. It's beautiful, functional, and designed around the knowledge that ships and piers will eventually intersect, no matter how good your procedures are. The dolphins surrounding its main supports are massive, engineered to stop a vessel far larger than the Summit Venture before it reaches anything critical. In 2005, the bridge was officially renamed the Bob Graham Sunshine Skyway Bridge, honoring the governor who pushed for its creation and refused to settle for simply rebuilding what had failed. The old assumption died on May 9, 1980. The idea that visibility, pilotage, and procedures could reliably prevent collisions, that operational control was sufficient protection, didn't survive the collapse. The industry moved on. Standards changed. New bridges were designed differently. But something else died too: the public's unconscious confidence that infrastructure just works. Before the Skyway, most people didn't think about how bridges stay up. After the Skyway, the question became unavoidable. What happens if the system fails? What happens if the procedures break down, if the warnings aren't issued, if visibility drops to zero? The answer for the old Skyway was that 1,297 feet of bridge fell 150 feet into Tampa Bay, and 35 people died. In 2015, a memorial was dedicated listing the names of everyone who died that morning. It stands near the replacement bridge, a quiet acknowledgement that the system failed and people paid the price. The names are there because someone decided they shouldn't be forgotten, that the efficient new bridge with its massive protective dolphins shouldn't erase what happened on the old one. For those who were there, the bridge carries different weight. Steve Yared, Laro's attorney, sees the courtroom when he looks at it. Robert Raiola, the diver who recovered the bodies, sees something else. When I think of the Skyway, when I see it, unfortunately I see the victims in that bus, he said. The bridge is both monument and reminder, a physical testament to what was learned and a haunting memory of how the lesson was taught. The lesson the Skyway teaches isn't motivational. It's specific and structural. If your safety model relies on visibility and perfect procedure, a storm doesn't just reduce performance, it removes the system entirely. When your design philosophy assumes failure won't happen, you build infrastructure that can't survive its own mistakes. The old Skyway worked for decades because conditions stayed normal. Ships navigated precisely. Weather warnings were issued, pilots had visibility, procedures were followed. The system hummed along invisibly, unremarked, trusted. Then one morning, A squall moved through Tampa Bay without a warning. A pilot lost his references, and a ship hit a pier that wasn't designed to be hit. The bridge disappeared. Not slowly, not with warning signs, not with time to evacuate. It disappeared in the time it takes to drive across a span, and 6 vehicles went with it. What remains is a replacement bridge, a fishing pier, a memorial, and a change in how the United States designs infrastructure that coexists with maritime traffic. The specific engineering responses, dolphins, collision analysis, standardized guidance, are technical, but the underlying shift is cultural. The acceptance that systems fail, that procedures break down, that the abnormal case will eventually arrive. The old approach treated collisions as low-probability events that could be managed through operational control. The new approach treats them as inevitable events that must be survived through physical design. One philosophy assumes the system works, the other assumes the system fails. The difference is 1,297 feet of roadway and 35 lives. That's what it cost to learn that fragility built into assumptions doesn't stay theoretical forever. Eventually, the weather comes. Eventually, the warnings don't go out. Eventually, someone is navigating blind in a squall and makes their best guess about where the channel is. And eventually, that guess is wrong. The Skyway's lesson is simple and brutal. When your bridge relies on perfect conditions to avoid catastrophe, the catastrophe is already built in. You're just waiting for the morning when the conditions stop being perfect. May 9th, 1980, was that morning. At 7:34 a.m., the assumptions collapsed along with the bridge.